Hello everybody and welcome to this month's Contract Administration Practice Group call for CSI. With that, I do want to hand it over to Douglas and Jim as we tend to run over, and I want to make sure my part is short. So Doug and Jim, over to you and we can get started with today's topic.
Thank you, Matthew. Welcome everyone. We are talking about inclement weather days today, and as we do so here in North Carolina where I am, the weather is perfect. Don't know how it is where you are, but hopefully you guys aren't out in the storm getting wet. I would like to thank Barry Lemons, who suggested this topic following last month's meeting, and he suggested this topic, and so we're going to go ahead and present it today. Jim?
I'll just say hello everybody, and let's dig in.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. So when weather does impact your project, I would say that the first place that you need to look, if you are not intimately familiar with it, is you got to look to the contract. Most contracts provide clauses in there that address weather delays and weather issues. Typically, they provide that weather delays are excusable but not compensable, which means that the contractor is entitled to additional time but not any additional money. Make sure, again, that you review the contract. Don't assume that it's going to be the standard AIA language, even though that's what we're going to be referring to mostly today. If you are not using a AIA contract, or the owner has modified it, or the owner is using their own standard or their own custom contract for your project, you need to make sure that you're familiar with what's in that project for that contract for that project. Next slide.
While you're going to the next slide, I'll just throw in that if you reference back to the practice guide, we're looking in Chapter 3, which is under the pre-construction title, and there's just a very short blurb in there about weather conditions and what potential delays are. So, as Doug said, it is so brief in the practice guide because it is so different between documents as to how weather or the impact of weather is dealt with.
So what you see on the screen now is the language from the AIA A201 agreement, the general conditions, and also from the consensus document. They are brief, and I'm going to read the AIA language. If adverse weather conditions are the basis for a claim for additional time, such claims shall be documented by data substantiating that weather conditions were abnormal for the period of time, could not have been reasonably anticipated, and had an adverse effect on the scheduled construction. So it says there what the conditions need to be in order for the contractor to be entitled to additional time. I'm not going to read the consensus document language that's there, but it's pretty similar. So to have a successful claim, it must be documented with data to show that the conditions were abnormal, the conditions must be abnormal, and they could not have been reasonably anticipated. And then they have to have an adverse effect on the schedule. So that being said, you could conclude, and it's true, that not all or any bad weather is a cause for a contract extension. It must be caused by abnormal weather, and it could not have been reasonably anticipated, and it also must have an effect on the schedule. So all those conditions have to be met in order for a contract extension to be granted. Next slide.
It'd be interesting to take a look back at what this past winter's effects may be as we move forward. I'm sure that there may be some adjustment in some areas around the country because of the significant weather that was had this winter over what might be reasonably anticipated. And it's just that sort of thing that makes this such a regionalized effort that in many cases shows up in great detail in the general conditions or supplementary general conditions for the projects that you might be writing, but we'll talk more about that in a bit.
Okay, so we have looked at the contract, and I would assume that everyone would still have questions, as I know after reading that I would. And on the screen you see some of the questions that I would have. What constitutes adverse weather conditions? And how do we determine if the weather condition is abnormal and if it could have not been reasonably anticipated? What constitutes an adverse effect on the construction schedule, or more commonly called a delay? And what time period do we use? Are we looking at the entire contract time? Are we looking at this 1 year, irregardless of the contract time? Are we looking at a month, a week, a day, part of a day? What's the period we're talking about? And then lastly, I would ask the question, just from looking at that language we looked at on the previous slide, is what is the documentation that's required? So the language that's in these standard contracts leaves room for disagreement about a weather delay by not defining all the terms. So I would suggest, if you are assisting your owner in preparing his contract for construction and you're using the AIA or whatever language you're using, whatever boilerplate contract you're using, is that you supplement it with supplementary general conditions, or in your Division 1 specs that helps define these terms to help everyone be on the same page and avoid confusion and disagreements in the future. So with that, before you move to the next slide, let's ask the audience if they have any questions. And Jim, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add at this point.
No, let's see if there are any questions. I did see, I think that Barry Lemons is with us, and I don't know if he heard your shout out there in the beginning, Doug, but Barry, thank you. What Doug said at the beginning, if you weren't on here, is thank you for the subject matter suggestion here.
So Matthew, do we have any questions from the participants at this point?
There's just a comment here from Kevin. He indicates that he thinks the AIA claims reference should be Section 15, not Section 4. And Barry says you're welcome for the good idea.
Okay. I would have to go back and I don't have the general conditions in front of me and check. It could be 15. But thank you both. Let's go to the next slide, and as we go forward here, we're going to try to address the questions that we raised from the slide we just left. So the first one was, what constitutes adverse weather? Adverse weather can come in the form of high or low temperatures, precipitation, rain, snow, hail, ice, and I threw in lightning there, even though lightning isn't necessarily considered precipitation. It's usually included with a rainstorm or something like that, but you can also have like a lightning storm and not have any precipitation. But lightning could also be a condition where it would have an adverse effect on the work or job site safety. And high wind conditions and high and low humidity conditions, which make it these conditions make it either not reasonable or not safe for employees exposed to these conditions to work on the site. Jim, I don't know if there's anything you want to add here, or if I missed anything in terms of what would constitute an adverse weather condition.
No, I think you've covered them here, and it's certainly, and we'll talk about this as we go forward. Well, let me just leave there. No, I don't see anything else, Doug.
Okay. So then let's go to the next question in the next slide. Now that we know what adverse weather conditions are, and talk about whether it's abnormal or could not have been reasonably anticipated. So how do you make that determination? And the most common method is to compare your actual weather experience to historical data for the same location during the same time of year. A good source, an excellent source for historical weather data is the NOAA website. And NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or the National Weather Service. And if you go to www.weather.gov, their site will come up, and there's just a wealth of information. You can go back and look at your weather conditions for your particular area. It breaks down in most cases by even down by precipitation per hour. So it's a wealth of data there. And if you haven't used that site, I would suggest that you take a look at that. And as we said, that analysis should be limited to your geographic area and the time of the year that your weather conditions are being experienced. I was born and raised in Michigan, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the winters there and the winters here in Raleigh, North Carolina are quite different, and the reaction to them is quite different. Down here, when there even is a trace of snow possible, there are chances that cities will close down, just with the forecast calling for a trace of snow. In Michigan, it takes several inches before the cities are going to close down. So just by looking at that, you can see that the geographical areas, what's expected, what the contractor is expected the conditions to work under are vastly different. So you need to be conscious of what area you're working in. If you practice in, say, North Carolina and then have a project in Michigan, and you are expecting folks to react to the weather the same way, that's not going to be the case. So abnormal can mean both unusual in the number of days of the severe weather at the site, and it also can mean unusually severe weather conditions during a particular period at the site. And what I mean by that, it could be that it rains for, and these are extremes, 30 days out of 31 in a month, when it typically only rains 7. That would be the first condition. And the second would be where during, say, the month of February, you get typically 2 days of rain, and that rain total is less than an inch, that in one day you get 3 inches of rain. So hopefully that is clear when we talk about the number of days and also unusually severe conditions during a specific time period. And you also must consider what could reasonably have been anticipated, and that again goes back to looking at the conditions that are at your geographic location. So complaining about rain delays during the monsoon season isn't going to work, because if you're in monsoon season, you should reasonably expect that there's going to be a lot of rain. Any comments? I'm sorry, Jim, go ahead.
No, that's exactly what I was going to do, is ask if there are any questions, Matthew, and then I was going to throw in a couple of things.
Oh, yeah, we just had a couple of comments here. One is a question that I responded to Joe, but I'll bring it up here as well. He was wondering how any of this relates to residential renovations. So I did point out CSI doesn't normally happen in the individual residential field. We're typically commercial construction and multifamily construction, but I would want to bring that up just because it is a comment from the audience. But additionally, I wanted to bring in some comments here. We had that courts and arbitration boards have differing ideas of what constitutes adverse or abnormal weather and what types of time extensions should be granted for them. Local media outlets such as TV stations, for example, and even wastewater utilities often maintain weather data stations that may be more numerous in a given area than the NWS or NOAA stations.
Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
I was going to say that NOAA is not the only source but they are an excellent source, and they cover the entire country, whereas some of the local TV stations or other agencies would just cover that particular area. So if you are working at a site that is outside of your home state or your home city, NOAA would be an excellent source to go and look at to get a general view of what's going on for that area. I know I've used NOAA as well as other local resources, and I have found that NOAA is one that is accepted and recognized by courts and arbitration systems.
And I would say, going back to the residential question, it definitely would depend on the type of contract that you had in place for the project. So it may be that they would address some weather delays in there within the contract, but what Doug mentioned a minute ago about supplementary general conditions, and I have been associated with projects where this information that we're discussing here was not only noted, but for example, the weather site, the NOAA site, which was going to be the official measuring site for this project, was included in the contract documents, in the supplementary general conditions. So we agree by signing this contract, here's the site we're going to use to measure. It may also say that we're going to use the last blank, the last 5 years of weather data as an average, or the last 10 years of weather data as an average, and establish those years specifically. And then also include a statement along the lines of, here's what we define as abnormal. So we look at this data, and over the last 10 years there have been 20 weather days that don't meet our criteria for being able to move ahead with construction, too much rain or etc. And so we want you to include 10 days of adverse weather in your schedule. So they've been told that up front. And then also maybe include, here's what we define as an abnormal rain day where there's this much rain, or snow day where there's this much snow, and be totally specific about the definition of abnormal. Now, that's a lot of work and a lot of front end and a lot of supplementary information, but I've seen that be a method to attempt to reduce the number of requests and or consternation over a definition of a term.
I agree that that is a lot of work, but that is what I would recommend that one do. It just makes things clearer, easier. Everyone's on the same page. You have less disagreements. Going back to the comment about local TV stations or other organizations that track weather, I have seen where a contractor is submitting maps and the owner is saying, no, I want to look at what NOAA has, and the information is not the same. And who's to say which one's more accurate? So as Jim said, in the supplemental general conditions, you can even identify what source you're going to use for the historical data. And as far as residential renovation, and if I remember right, he did say renovation, I think that the same conditions would apply if you're using the same contract language, is that the weather would have to be adverse, it have to be documented, it could not have been reasonably anticipated, it would have to be abnormal for the time period that we're talking about, and it would have to affect the construction schedule. Now, for renovations on interior renovations, I think it would be hard to put forth an argument that rain, when you're doing interior renovations, is a cause for a contract extension because it's the rain really affecting the schedule of work being done in a protected interior environment. And I think the criteria would be the same, provided using the same contract language, whether it's a residential project or a commercial project. So not just any bad weather can cause a contract extension. It must be caused by that normal weather that could not have been reasonably anticipated. And that needs to be looked at in terms of the time of year in which it occurred and the place in which it occurred. So no matter how severe or destructive, if the weather is not unusual, or if the contractor should have reasonably anticipated it, then the contractor would not be entitled to a time extension.
And Doug, you go into that description on the next slide.
Yeah, before we go to the next slide, I wanted, Joe did some additional clarification here. I was wondering specifically, and I'm not sure if we do it, I haven't looked at the slides before today, so I haven't seen where we're going. But at some point, if we don't talk about, he's wondering how it may relate to weather planning with regards to possibly like concrete additives or just the storing of lumber or building materials on site. So depending on how we reach onto that, that might be something we want to touch back at the end of the session today.
I'm going to touch on it just a bit here because I don't think we touch on it in this presentation, and I don't want to forget about it at the end. As far as additives and storage of materials, that's not addressed in this presentation. Additives to concrete. I have my own personal feelings about additives to concrete that I will go ahead and share. I don't like putting additives in concrete at all, period. And when I write my specs, I don't allow it. Now, there are others that do allow you to put plasticizers and things in there based on the temperature, but that's just my personal preference. As far as a weather delay issue, I think it's more of an impact as to whether or not the concrete can be placed. If it's raining, you're not going to be able to place it. If, in my case, if I'm saying I don't want any additives in it and it's extremely hot, then that may be a case where you're not going to be able to place it. Materials storage, I don't know that I've really given that a whole lot of thought in terms of weather impact on a project. It's the contractor's responsibility to store material and store it in a safe manner, and whether it's lumber or drywall or whatever it is, he needs to store it in a manner to where it's not going to be damaged by the weather. And I don't know if that touches on everything that was in that question, but like I said, I didn't want to not address it because if we keep going, I probably will forget about it. Jim, I don't know if you've got anything to add there.
No, I don't think so.
So if that didn't address the question, then we'd ask whoever asked that to raise it again at the end, and maybe we can get into it a little more. So let's move on to the next slide. Other things to consider that aren't specifically addressed in the contract, Jim and I, we've already kind of talked about some of this stuff. The amount of precipitation needed during a day for it to be an impact. If it's a trace of rain, is it really impacting the work? What time of day does a precipitation occur, excuse me? And was it on a work day? I've had contractors request an extension when it rained over the weekend and they were not planning on working over the weekend. I've had contractors ask for an extension when it was a holiday and they weren't working on the holiday. I've had contractors ask for an extension when the rain started at 6 p.m. and ended at 10 p.m. and it was, say, 1/10 of an inch of rain, so there wasn't issues with mud on the site the next day. But if you look at the data for that day, it did rain, and had it rained during the hours when they were working on the site, it would have had an impact. But it happened to have rained on that day after they had stopped working, but the contractor was still trying to request an extension. So what time that occurs is also an important thing to consider. The mud or drought days, whether it's dealing with mud or dewatering or snow removal or ice removal, that also needs to be considered. It could rain, like in the example I gave, after work hours, and had rained enough to where the site is muddy, so that the next day when it's not raining, it impacts the work. So the day that it rained may not be a valid day to claim, but the day after, in drying out the site and dealing with the mud, may be. So you have to consider those days as well. So one, and Jim mentioned this, one thing you might want to consider is including in the contract a specific number of days to be lost or affected in the contract itself. So for May, you might say plan on 6 adverse weather days in May, and on 10 in April, 5 in June, and just put in the contract how many days for each month if the contractor would be able to, or should be expecting, or should plan on. And in that way, it kind of cuts out, again, some of the disagreements that could occur, some of the interpretation issues that could occur, and it's just clear gets everybody on the same page. So those are some things that you should consider when you're looking at weather days and looking at your contract and trying to clarify the language that's not clearly defined in the standard AIA and consensus type language.
And I would add to that, you may want to add some verbiage about accumulation of those days. So, for example, there may be a phase of the project where the weather and or related impact days really do have a significant effect on the schedule, and we're going to talk about that next. But at a point in the project where it doesn't affect negatively forward progress, where you may be out of the ground, for example, and have areas where you can do work that may not be totally dried in but are under roof. So these days stop applying or are not a part of consideration. And establishing that in those supplementary general conditions up front can help you from spending a lot of time battling over things that maybe you don't need to be battling over later on in the project. But we talk about how to define that here in the next few slides.
So let's go to the next slide and talk about the next question that we raised earlier on, and that is what constitutes an adverse effect on the construction schedule or a delay. So the adverse weather must limit the ability to perform the work. You have to determine if the inclement weather affected the work progress, affected material deliveries, access to the site, safety measures, or whatever the impact was, that it have an adverse effect on the construction schedule that it actually caused a delay. It's just because it's bad weather doesn't automatically mean that it was a delay. The weather must actually impact the schedule. Did the contractor stop work? Were people sent home? Could they access the site? Could they not work because the sheetrock that was supposed to be delivered wasn't able to be delivered because the road was flooded out? So all of those considerations need to be looked at. So the weather could be severe and not affect critical path work. And when we're talking about affecting the schedule, that's what we're talking about. Did it affect work that was on the critical path? We talked before in previous presentations about float and who owns float and all, but activities that are not on that critical path do have some float in there, and that float will take up for any impact that the weather may have. If that's the case, then that's not going to be an actual effect on the schedule. So the work must affect, or the delay of severe weather must affect work that is on the critical path. You need to look at, again, we mentioned this before, is whether or not the work affected is in an enclosed protected area. If the work that's going on at the site is in an enclosed protected area and there's bad weather, then they may not be entitled, in that case, to an extension. So the severe weather can affect non-critical work activities and critical work activities, and it's the critical work activities are on the critical path are the ones that would be eligible for a time extension. If they're not, then they probably would not merit a time extension. So before we move on to the next slide, let's see if we have any comments from folks from the last two slides where we're talking about
Yeah, I was just gonna. There was a comment here that you then touched on when you talked about the critical path, so I think that's good to go. And then Kevin just pointed in here with regards to Joe's question that we talked about on the last slide. Delays caused by improper storage or delays within the contractor's control are delays within the contractor's control, and therefore would probably not be available for an extension. So it was just a little bit of clarification he added to the other call, but nothing else at this point.
Okay, I think that's good. So let's move to the next slide. So that brings us to the other question I raised earlier on, is what time period do we use? Are we talking about, again, the entire contract time, a week, a month, a day? And for claims, typically, the request is based on days. The contractor typically is going to request a day for a day. I have never seen, Jim, I don't know if you have or not, I've never seen a contractor say, well, it started raining at 12 o'clock, and so we had to stop work, and so I want a half a day. If that happens, they still can say it's a day. I would suggest that you look at it in that manner. It's easier to kind of put your arms around and understand the impacts on a daily basis as opposed to trying to break it down into hours or minutes or something smaller than that. So when you're looking at claims for time, again, typically it's based on days. When you're looking at, for claims, again, the period of tracking it is typically done on a monthly basis. So typically, you would say for the month of February, we had 10 days of rain. The contract called for, or historical data shows that we typically have 7, and so therefore we had 3 days of impact to the schedule. That's 3 days, the 10 days being 3 days more than the 7 that was in the contract that could have been reasonably anticipated. So that's usually looked at for tracking it on a monthly basis. Now, I have seen, and I know Jim has run into some of our state monitors here in North Carolina that say, well, we recognize that there were these days, but let's not actually put them in a change order or grant them to the contractor until the end of the project to see whether or not they truly are affecting it. And that is this issue that I'm talking about here for rollover. So what happens if you have 3 days that are valid to be claimed in February, and you should anticipate 4 for March, but there are none in March? Do the 4 that didn't get used in March roll over and affect the 3 from February, or vice versa? My suggestion would be that you don't. I'm sorry, Jim, did you want to jump in there?
Well, yeah, no, you're going ahead. I just, no, go ahead. Sorry, I was going to jump in and say just that I have had that very experience, and you end up in a spot where you don't want to be, but go ahead.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting to. Is my suggestion is that you track it on a monthly basis, and if days are due for February, you grant them in February or shortly thereafter. Is typically the request to come after the end of the month. So you grant those for that month, and you look at them on a month-by-month basis, and you don't deal with this rollover issue. You don't say, well, for the entire contract period, which was a 2-year contract, they should have had 20 days in there, and it only rained, when you look at the entire 2-year period, 19 days, and say, well, so they don't get a delay. I think you should look at it on a month-by-month basis and say, yes, in February, they had 3 days, give them the 3 days. Again, it's time only, it's not money. And I think if you start to do anything else, you're going to end up spending money in time and effort in trying to put together arguments and documentation. It's going to cost you more than if you gave them the time to begin with. Doing it on a monthly basis, easy, straightforward, everybody can understand it. You don't get into the issues and arguments and trying to track rollover and on, and that would be my recommendation.
Well, I think that's right, and I think you start to build. We talk about this on calls about a momentum for a job, and you start to build a team concept and really try to move forward together. And I think that when you do sit down and do this, as Doug said, and you deal with it on a monthly basis up front, and you say, okay, there were 6 days this month, and we said in the contract that there could be as many as 8. So you're not getting any rain days for this month because it didn't exceed what we anticipated. Let's put that in the books and move on. And perhaps deal with that 2-day rollover question. Is it going to carry over or not? Maybe you did a thorough job in the general conditions and you documented that so that you address how rollover is dealt with and what you do about that. That certainly would be a good idea. But I think you're right, and it's a much fairer way to deal with the process.
Okay. So when you're looking at the historical data, what time period should you be looking at? And typically what I've seen is a 3-year period or a 5-year period. Jim had mentioned a 10-year period. I don't think I've ever done a project that's been based on looking at a 10-year average, but I have done one where they said, well, it's the previous year. And that could get you into trouble in that the previous year could have been an abnormal situation where it was either an unusually high period or a year with an unusually high amount of adverse weather or a year of an unusually low amount. And then that's going to play into it, and it's not going to be fair either to the contractor or in theory to the owner, depending on whether it was more rain or less rain or precipitation or whatever the condition was. And so using an average period, I think, for 3 to 5 years, again, my recommendation, that would be the way to go, and not just look at 1 year. A final note that these are claims, and there are claim clauses in the contract that require claims to be submitted within a certain time period. In AIA, it's 21 days after the occurrence of the event, or 21 days after the claimant first recognizes the condition giving rise to the claim. So those claim procedures also need to be followed. So if there's a 21-day time period for submitting the claim, and they wait till the end of the project and say, okay, here's my weather delay, I would say that they're subject to having those days declined for not complying with the procedures for submitting the claim.
And that's your next slide.
And that also rolls back into the discussion we had before about doing them on a monthly basis and not trying to have this rollover. So before we go to the next slide, let's see if there's questions comments on this?
Nope, we're pretty quiet on this end right now.
Okay. So the next question on the next slide is what documentation is required. And my first statement here is follow what's called for in the contract documents. And if you look again back at the AIA language, it didn't really say what documentation was required. But in the claims section, there typically is language in there. So if in the claims section it says claims need to be issued, notice needs to be given by certified letter, then this request for weather delays, you need to do it by certified letter. You need to submit details of the work, a description or outline or documentation to detail what work was affected by the weather delays. We couldn't pour concrete because of XYZ on these days. So be clear on in detailing what work was affected, was concrete work, why it was affected, what days. So have that detailed in there. Contractor needs to submit the historical data, provided that the days are not given in the contract. The historical data to establish the abnormal conditions. And if this is an average of 3 years, then they need to have the historical data for the previous 3 years showing that, and then giving the average so that there's the data to compare it to. You need to submit the current data to show that there was an actual weather event. So you've got the NOAA sites that may not only show historical data, they'll show the current data. Or you can use the local reporting status, or you can use actual data that the contractor itself is recording at the job site. Now again, you may want to define in your supplemental general conditions what data is going to be acceptable. Is it going to be acceptable for the contractor to have a rain gauge and measure precipitation on the site, or is it going to be based on NOAA or something else? But the current data needs to be submitted as well. A good thing that I always ask contractors to submit is their daily logs or their progress reports. This clearly shows what activities were going on at the site on a particular day, whether or not they sent folks home, how many people were working. If they're doing their job right, it'll note that we showed up at 7. We had 10 workmen getting ready to pour concrete, and it started raining at 8, and so we had to stop the pour and everybody went home. And if that's documented in the log, that's a clear evidence as to what happened. I typically ask for daily logs, not just to be submitted with weather claims, but I typically ask for them to submit me all their daily logs on a weekly basis so that we can kind of have an idea of what's going on out at the site. They need to submit schedules to show that the weather delay actually impact the critical path work. And if you've got them doing a CPM schedule, that should be pretty easy for them to do. And then photos help to establish the conditions that are at the site. I don't necessarily request photos to be submitted with a weather claim. I've had them submitted, and like they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's a great piece of documentation to show the conditions on the site, and they really help out in the mud and dry out days, to where it's easy for someone to go back and look at data to say, yeah, it rained on this day, the next day it didn't rain. But if you weren't at the site, you wouldn't know whether or not there was an issue with mud or snow removal or whatever. And those photographs of those conditions are really helpful in that type of situation. Jim?
I don't see a thing to add there, Doug. I think you covered it well. Matthew, are there any questions about any of that?
Yeah, there was a question I thought had been answered, but apparently it wasn't, from Kevin. He was wondering, on the previous slide here, is it necessary to go through the claims process for the parties to agree to a change of contract times as a result of a weather delay?
I would say yes. I don't know. If you're changing the contract, you have to change it by the terms that are in that contract, and that means that there has to be a change order. I don't know of any other way to change the contract duration other than doing it by change order. A simple handshake agreement, you could do that, but where's the documentation? What are you going to present in court? Where's your paper trail? If, God forbid, you have to go to court over an issue, you're going to want to have your documentation in order so that you can convince the judge and the jury, who may know nothing about construction. You got to convince them of your position. Having a verbal agreement or something like that, I would say, would not be the way to go. I would follow all of the typical change procedures that are in the contract documents.
And Kevin clarified here, he was wondering specifically with the difference of a claim versus whether or not a change order does not necessarily equal a claim.
I'm not sure I'll follow that. The
I think
contractor is asking for a time extension. That is a claim. And if it's going to be granted, the way to grant it would be with the change order. If it's going to be denied, then there would not be a change order, but the contractor still would have had submitted a claim asking for the additional days. Does that make sense?
Sure. Kevin's asking to be unmuted, so I'm going to do that.
Okay.
We'll see if we have clarification. So, Kevin, you are unmuted. If you want to say your name and we can verify that we can hear you.
Hi, folks. This is Kevin O'Byrne.
Yep, you're good.
Hi.
Hey, Kevin. It's been a while.
Obviously, a topic that's of great interest to me. So, thanks for indulging all of my comments and so forth. But what I was getting at was that, and this is the case with a lot of standard construction documents, it looks like the only way to really affect the change is to go through the claims process, which is kind of a formalized thing. There's, the word claim sort of has a negative aspect to it. Sometimes there's contractor qualification statements that say, how many claims have you had on your jobs lately? And if you have to file a claim just to get an extension of time because of a weather delay, do the parties really have to go through the formalized claims process, or can they just do it via a change order? I fully recognize that, a verbal agreement to some change in the time is not the way to go. It's got to be in writing. It's got to be formalized as a change order. But I guess when you're looking at weather-related delays, is the only way to reach that change order to go through the formal claims process, or can there be something that a little bit less intense and kind of less, I guess, somewhat adversarial kind of thing is what's implied or frequently interpreted in the claims process?
To me, and it may be the attorney training, any request by the contractor of additional time or additional money is a claim. Now, it may not necessarily rise to the level of a perceived notion of a claim being going to court and folks that being at odds and all, but it is still a claim. They're claiming that they need additional time or additional dollars because of a certain circumstance. And it may be even in the case of like an owner requested change, the contractor is going to submit his change proposal. That, in my world, or by my definition, is still a claim. He's claiming additional money for this additional work that the contractors or that the owner had requested. So it doesn't have a negative connotation to me, but I can see where you're coming from. And if
when I speak with contractors, they feel that it has a very negative thing to it, that they would, maybe be considered to have to file claims all the time, because it snowed for 60 days straight or something. This really is getting into, I think, a larger issue that goes beyond just merely weather delays, and I apologize for, seemingly sidetracking the discussion, but...
No. I want to jump into this, Kevin, because I think you bring up a great point. If you go back to
I'm sorry, just one minor last thing is that, in any of my jobs where I've had a contractor ask for an extension of time due to some kind of weather delay or something beyond his control, they send it to you as an email. They don't file it as a claim in accordance with the formal notice provisions of the contract. And so, of course, I don't want to deny what the guy ought to get just because he sent it to me as an email rather than by certified mail or something. But, there's also that kind of whole thing about when does it have to be a claim and when does it, that, there's all the formalities of how it's actually filed and submitted, which, anyway, I'm done now. Sorry.
Okay, Jim, before you jump in, let me comment on it. To me, that email would still be a claim, and I think that's the rub that you and I are discussing here is what is a claim by definition. And I've said this to Jim before, and I'll say it here, is we write the book. So if you want to write in your specs that you don't have to follow the claim procedures in section whatever of the contract and send an email is all you have to do, then that's fine. But I think it needs to be defined in the contract what the procedure is. And if it's not a full-blown out certified letter thing, I think that's fine, but I think that needs to be stated in the contract. Jim?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think first, Kevin, it is a great question, and I think two, it turns on what you just described a second ago as what is our preconceived notion about the word claim. So if you go to the practice guide and you look at page 205, there is a very elaborate diagram there of a claim. And what I would say to you is there's a real error in this diagram. There should show a path that we're just talking about here. So bear with me for a second. Under the definition of claims, something that was out of the contractor's control is a claim. Well, that's weather. And there should be a pathway on this diagram that is the processing of a claim that is not at issue. So the event occurs, it's documented like it should be, information goes to the designer of record, so as you said, you could accept that as an email, claim is processed and added to a change order. And by Doug's definition, it is a claim, and there's an easy way to document a uncontested claim. And so I think it's a great point of conversation of how we should establish a way to deal with something that maybe brings the word claim a little closer to what really its definition is and not at issue. Anyway, sorry.
Anything else, Matthew, from anyone?
Yeah, there's an additional question from Barry. We've been talking about rain and snow and things of that nature, but is adverse temperature alone considered valid for a delay claim?
Actually, yes. And I think that was in one of the first slides, is that high or low temperatures would be an adverse weather condition that could affect either the progress of the work or the safety on the site. I know I've been on a job, it was a re-roofing job, and the temperatures were over 100 degrees, and we said, no, it's too hot, you can't work up here. And they didn't work. And in that particular case, it was not to where we had to grant a time extension, but there could have been. It could have lasted a week, and typically during that month, you could have only expected 1 day. And so whether it's high temperature or low temperature, it certainly could be considered an adverse weather condition that could affect the progress of the work and safety on the site. So my answer to that is yes, just temperature alone could be cause for an adverse weather day.
All right, and then we had one additional comment from Kevin, which he didn't bring up when we unmuted his line, but I wanted to make sure it was made. He says, interestingly, AIA A201 section 8.3.3 opens the door to the contractor receiving a change in the contract sum, in addition to the change of contract time for weather-related delays.
Go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say that's a great example of what you might do with your supplementary general conditions to bring those in line with what you might want to say about weather impact, and clarify that point that we'll give you time but we don't give you money if that's what you choose to do. Matthew, are you hearing a beeping on the phone? Is that just me?
Yeah, I'm hearing it. I'm not sure where it is.
I think that's me. Hold on a second.
No problem. I have no other questions at this point, so I'm going to move to the last slide because we are getting, or the next slide because we are getting to the end of the hour here. I'm not sure if we just lost Douglas.
It may have.
It sounds like it.
Well,
Sorry about that.
Doug, are you there? Okay.
Yeah. So, potential pitfalls. If the owner directs the contractor to perform work in inclement weather, then the owner may be liable to the contractor for production inefficiencies and additional costs of performing such work. He or she may also be liable for any injuries that may occur during while the contractor is performing that work in inclement weather. So the message there is not to insist that contractors perform during inclement weather. And if the owner fails to grant a time extension to which the contractor is entitled to due to inclement weather, then you may be liable for the contractor's extra costs in manpower, equipment, or whatever necessary to maintain that schedule. So that would be the acceleration costs. And the last one would be if the architect fails to grant a weather delay to which the contractor is entitled. The architect may be liable to the contractor for negligence. So again, if they're due an extension, go ahead and grant it and get it in there and move on. Next slide. One last issue, the exception to the rule that we were talking about in terms of that the delay is excusable but not compensable. So would be under certain circumstances it can be compensable if the delay, which is beyond the contractor's control, pushes the work into a season which, had it not occurred, the work would have been performed at a time that it would not have been affected by the weather. But the weather is usually worse during that time where it's pushed into. In those cases, the claims aren't technically weather delay claims, they're more inefficiency or diminished productivity claims or acceleration claims. An example would be say that there were unforeseen conditions that delayed site work, and the contractor had planned on pouring concrete in the fall, but because of unforeseen site conditions, there was unsuitable soils or rock or whatever that pushed the concrete pour back into the winter, then the delays that occurred during the winter that affected this concrete pours, that could be compensable. So you need to look at whether delays that occurred prior to your weather issues push the work into a time period as to where it affects the schedule due to the fact that the work was being performed at a time when the weather was more severe than had it not been pushed back.
I'll give you a good example of that. We had a project that was a 2.5-year project, and in each of the first 2 years there was a hurricane that directly hit the job site, so that it not only did damage but moved work out of sequence to winter work where it was not able to be done. So in the end, we had 2 significant weather impact events that were based in inefficiencies and diminished productivity, followed by then the owner having to accelerate the project to be able to open these places on time and not miss another school year. So you just can't know what may happen.
So let's go on and wrap this up. Go to the next slide, please. So in summary, you need to know your contract provisions and supplement them where they are unclear. We talked about that throughout. Time extensions for weather days are in order when they are due to adverse weather conditions for the time period. If they could not reasonably have been anticipated, they adversely affect the scheduled construction, they are properly documented, and they are submitted timely in accordance with the contract requirements. If a contractor is entitled to a weather delay, you should grant it to them. And under certain circumstances, the weather delays can be compensable. So that kind of wraps it up. Let's see if we've got anything from any last questions. Matthew? Any last comments, Jim?
Nothing here from the audience. Oh, Kevin, actually, I just noticed here, put in, what's the basis for saying that the architect was negligent on the last bullet?
If the contractor was due a claim and the architect denied the claim, the architect would then the claim would, from the contractor, would be that the architect was negligent in performing his duties in construction administration and denying the claim because he was actually entitled to the claim. And that was the claim that the contractor could bring against the architect in court. And if the contractor's got his documentation showing that historically or per contract I was supposed to get 5 days in March, we actually had 7. And so I was due 2 days, the architect denied me 2 days, he was negligent in not awarding me those 2 days. He's going to be liable to me for that amount of money. So if the contractor had to accelerate to meet the schedule because he didn't get the 2 days, then the architect would be liable for the contractor's acceleration costs for those 2 days. So Matthew, as we wrap it up, I will comment that our next meeting is going to be May 26th, as you can see on the bottom of the slide. Topics to be determined. I think this was a great topic that Barry recommended, and open to recommendations and suggestions from the group. Our emails will show on the next slide. You can contact me or Jim. They're there now. And Matthew, before we wrap up, I was going to let you comment on the other upcoming event. You guys, specifications workshop.
Thank you. I mean, it's coming around the corner. It's next weekend. But for those of you that may be in the Atlanta area or looking for travel for work, to get learning credits as well as some other things. I do just recommend those go to csinet.org/GSW. There will be the conference. I guess it's more of a summit of sorts for product representatives as well as guide specification writing related to that. That'll be hosted in Atlanta through CSI with some guest speakers coming in to kind of walk through what a guide spec is, how to write one, how to work with one, and then as a product rep, how to use that. Also then as an architect, designer, or contractor, how to read it and understand the information that might be inside a general guide spec as well.
Well, we thank everyone for participating. We hope to see you next month. And again, our emails are there. If you've got suggestions for topics, please send them to us. And hope everyone has a great month.